All right, so welcome back. We're now going to cover the final chapter in this course, at least in the phase on the specific opening theory. So this is about the Cambridge Springs with with bishop b4 and knight d2 on the 7th move. So what we see here is previously e3 is definitely the main move, and after queen a5, c takes d5 I think is the most common move, but I actually believe that knight d2 is equally challenging, and in recent years it has been preferred by a lot of the really strong players. This was also Ding Liren's choice against me in the Speed Chess Championship, and what I played against him wasn't that great. I thought it was equalizing, and then as I looked closer after those games, I found that his idea actually had a lot of merit to it, and I thought that I had to take a closer look. But I think what I found here, I'm pretty happy with. So the point of knight d2 is first and foremost, it's prophylaxis against knight e4. Clearly with queen a5, black wanted to play knight e4 and cause problems with this pin on the knight on c3. So with knight c2, knight e4 has largely been prevented, or well, I mean, as we'll see later on, there's times when it won't be prevented, but that's clearly one part of the idea. Another thing that white would like is to potentially take back with the knight on c4 if black ever captures. This way, he will gain a tempo by attacking the queen. So for a long time, the main line went d takes c4, and this opens up an attack on the bishop on g5, so of course white cannot take back on c4 just yet. But following bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, knight takes c4, queen c7, and rook c1, white's going to basically set up some kind of Catalan by playing g3, bishop g2, and castle. And while black's position is solid, it's very passive and a little bit uncomfortable, and that's not the way I think the semi-Slav should be played. And at first I sort of thought it should be equal, but the more I looked, the more I thought this was a little bit more pleasant for white. And I felt a bit unsatisfied and decided to look for more direct options. So I landed on this move bishop b4. Now, black is putting further pressure on this diagonal and making direct threats that white has to respect. So for example, now if white is foolish enough to proceed along with normal development with bishop e2, now black has a very nice threat that he can execute. He starts with bishop takes c3, bc, and now he doesn't take on c3. Then white, after this, white will castle and he gets good compensation thanks to his bishop pair, his lead in development, and black's somewhat offside queen. But instead of taking on c3, he first starts with the move knight e4, counter-attacking this bishop on g5, and now if the bishop were to move away, for example, something like bishop f4, now and only now he can play queen takes c3, and this comes at a moment when the knight is pinned and white cannot castle. So the absolute best white can hope for here, I mean, first of all, black is able to trade queens immediately with queen takes d2 check next move, which will severely limit any hope of white has of counterplay. In addition, black can also take on c3 with the knight, and then take white's bishop pair and basically just be a clean pawn up. So white can't move the bishop, but the problem is after knight takes e4, d takes e4, white is now hanging on both g5 and c3. So at this point, he has to save his bishop, and after something like bishop f4, queen takes c3 check, if white was able to castle out of check here, he'd probably be okay because he could hope to open the center with d5 and get his bishops moving and claim that black's development is not particularly great. But because he's going to have to play king f1, which means that he's really going to coordinate very badly and this rook can't come out, I think black is already much better. For example, after e5, white's position seems really, really bad to me. So, of course, bishop e2 is extremely cooperative, and I would expect your opponents to play better than that. But it's good to note that black does have some threats that white has to take seriously. So, Hikaru actually played bishop f4 in this position once, which makes some sense because he's taking this bishop off of the hanging square and retreating to f4, and I guess he wasn't worried about losing a pawn because he thought that after something like bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, and rook c1, that white will get a lot of compensation after something like queen a5, bishop d3, when he will quickly castle, and his pieces are primed for a kingside attack where black seems very likely to castle. But I think I found a good solution to this, so I want to start with d takes c4. And the point is I want to do this now while white cannot take back with the knight, because if you were to take with the knight, now after bishop takes c3, this comes with check. And once again, we're seeing the same business that after queen takes c3 check, knight d2, white's being forced backwards, and black can even consider playing knight e4 here, which would immediately chop the queens off and cut down white's counterplay significantly and leaving black with an extra pawn. So following d takes c4, because this bishop takes c3 check would be a problem, white really needs to take back with the bishop on c4. And here black has, I think, a very important move, which we've seen before, but I want to go chase this dark squared bishop with knight h5. And the problem that white is facing here is not so much that he's going to lose his dark squared bishop, but rather that he's going to lose his dark squared bishop while also either having his pawn dragged to f4 or also losing a pawn on c3. So for example, if white castles after knight takes f4, I'm very happy to have dragged white's pawn to f4, and I think this structure really isn't very good for white, and black should be better. And if white were to play bishop g3, after knight takes g3, h takes g3, if black were to just like make some move here, I think that white would be doing pretty well. But I think at this point, now I'm very happy to go grab this pawn on c3, specifically because I got rid of this dark squared bishop that I'd be very worried would land on a square like d6 and cause me a lot of trouble. And as far as I can tell here, black is doing well. It's not like white has no compensation because he has some space in the center and black's development struggles a bit. But without white's dark squared bishop, I'm not nearly as scared of his attacking potential as I might otherwise be. And black can still proceed along with normal developments and should have a decent game. So, but this quickly leads us to the two main moves. So the main move by far, I believe, is queen c2, but in fact, I actually think the best one is rook c1. So we're going to see why. So if queen c2, I think now black can take on c4, pointing out that it's going to be much harder for white to pull off his optimal coordination with g3. So of course, white cannot take back on c4 directly. If you're foolish enough to automatically recapture with knight takes c4, this bishop on g5 is hanging. And white cannot save this bishop with something like bishop h4, as now after b5, black will retain his extra pawn with basically a winning position. So white is going to have to give up the bishop pair. And we saw this position a second ago, except without the moves bishop b4, queen c2 included, and I think this changes heavily in black's favor. So after knight takes c4, queen c7, the way white would really like to develop his pieces is to bring his bishop to g2 in the style of a Catalan, but he's just not quite fast enough here. For example, if he plays g3 now, black is already ready to play c5 and break down white's center, and after something like bishop g2 and bishop d7, I see absolutely nothing wrong with black's position because he managed to get c5 through. If you compare that to what would have happened if black had just taken on c4 directly, in a position like this one, after taking knight takes c4, queen c7, here white is playing rook c1, and he's really maximizing the pressure on the c5 square to the point that black cannot get it through very comfortably. For example, if black were to play c5 here, after knight b5, he's already getting completely smashed. And if you were to start with bishop b4, then, well, here white could play something like a3, and after bishop c3, rook c3, it's going to be basically impossible to get c5 through because this rook on the c-file is so annoying. But the way that we're playing here, by starting with bishop b4, queen c2, and now and only now dc4, following bishop f6, knight f6, knight c4, and queen c7, black is going to get c5 through and white can't stop him. At least I didn't find a way. The queen on c2 isn't great. White would much rather have the rook on c1, and that's actually why I think rook c1 is a better move. And there's really nothing I could find for white to do. For example, the most natural move I believe would be bishop d3. But after c5, castles, and now one final important move. You don't want to let white play knight b5 with a gain of tempo on the queen and then play a3 to trap this bishop. Black should start with bishop d7, and here he's absolutely fine because he's breaking down white's center at the source, and he faces no problems whatsoever. White could play the move queen b3, and if he had played rook c1 and then was able to play queen b3 in one move instead of wasting a move on queen c2 first, this position would be very problematic for black. But instead, he is ready to play c5 because, for instance, after a3, bishop takes c3 check. If white could play rook c1 takes c3 here, he would be much better, but he can't because he is fallen behind in development. So basically this theme of quickly playing knight takes c4, queen c7, and c5. It works better now because black's bishop is already outside the pawn chain. He's ready to get castled, and white has played queen c2, which is less than optimal. White can also take back with the bishop on c4, but it's also, this is a very inconsistent move when you consider how white had played previously. It's hard to justify playing knight d2 if you're not going to come and take with the knight on c4. And here I actually quite like a very direct move in e5, blowing open the center right away. And it looks a little bit scary because of the potential weakness on f7, but I can't find anything wrong with it. For example, after d takes e5, queen takes e5, it might look like you're having problems on f7 after queen b3, but I think after simply bishop takes c3, bishop takes f7 check, king f8, b takes c3, and now a very nice move b5, this bishop is going to get trapped. So because black is not falling apart immediately because of that nice trick, he's ready to castle next, and once he gets castled and is able to play e takes d4, leave white with an isolated pawn, and bring his bishop out to f5, he's going to have a very comfortable position with the bishop pair and good play against the isolated pawn. I think white's best move is queen b3 directly instead of taking on e5 first. And then what I found was that after castles d takes e5, white is now temporarily winning a pawn because we cannot take on e5 thanks to the hanging bishop. But black is okay because after bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, queen takes c3, b takes c3, and knight g4, white will not be able to hang on to his extra pawn. Black is obviously fine, and while I believe the position is very much equal, I think if anybody is going to be more comfortable, it's going to be black because of white's somewhat fractured queenside pawns. But there's no way for white to hang on to his pawn. For example, if knight f3, there will follow rook e8 and the pawn is lost. Or if f4, then the e3 pawn is hanging, and then things really start to get ugly for white. So I couldn't find anything special for white after queen c2. It seems like after d takes c4, it's very direct. White is forced into this position after bishop takes f6, or else he's going to end up just a pawn down. And at that point, I don't see how he's going to stop black from breaking with either c5 after knight takes c4. Well, okay, not hanging the queen, but knight takes c4, queen c7, and then c5. Or if bishop takes c4, he goes e5. So I just couldn't see how white was going to contain black's central pawn breaks to break down his space advantage. So with that in mind, I believe the best move is rook c1. And I think this is good prophylaxis because it prevents this plan that I want to play with d takes c4. If black were to play d takes c4 here and just try to play in the exact same manner, we're going to see why this doesn't work. After bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, knight takes c4, and queen c7, and black is hoping to play c5, white can play something like bishop d3. And with the rook back on, if white had played queen c2 here instead of rook d1, we were seeing that after c5, black was sort of okay. But here white can play something like queen b3. And because bishop takes c3 is going to be well met with rook takes c3, this position can become very difficult. In addition, black, after something like castles, as I mentioned here, I believe you have to try bishop d7. Here, this rook on the c-file is much more problematic than a queen would have been. So for example, here after knight e4, black is in horrible shape, because after something like knight takes e4, if white had put the queen on c2 here, black would just go c takes d4 and there would be no problem at all. As is, after c takes d4, queen takes d4, black is facing colossal problems. Queen g7 is hanging. This knight's going to move to e5, hitting this bishop, hitting the queen, hitting this bishop, and black is immediately falling apart. So I think this rook on c1 is extremely well placed and does a very good job of preventing me from accomplishing my goal of playing d takes c4. However, it also has a drawback that queen c2 didn't have, which is that it doesn't control the e4 square, while queen c2 did. And as a result, I think we can punish white for that by playing knight e4 here. So clearly with threats of both knight takes c3 and knight takes g5, white has to take on e4. Now both captures are interesting, but I think black is fine in both cases. And what's important to know is that black is actually, well, his position looks very suspect strategically, and it is. He is actually winning material on the spot, because no matter which knight white takes with, he's going to be hitting the bishop on g5 as well as the pawn on a2. So black is taking this pawn. So let's start with knight d takes e4, and then after d takes e4, here we have bishop h4 is the best move. Now, if black were to fall asleep at the wheel and just play something complacent like castle, after a3, I think he's approximately lost because his structure is horrible. He will have to lose the bishop pair immediately to avoid losing the pawn on e4. White has extra space. These pieces are passive. This is a really bad position, and you're basically already lost as far as I can tell. But we're not going to fall asleep at the wheel. Black goes and grabs this pawn on a2, which is more than just a pawn. It also harasses this guy, and it means that the bishop will be forever secure on b4, not having to worry about a3. So after white should play queen c2 now, otherwise he will lose the b2 pawn and things are going to get very ugly. And after queen c2, this is a very interesting position. If white is able to go bishop e2 and castle, then he will unpin this knight, threatening the queen. And then the e4 pawn will become vulnerable and things will get very ugly for black. So he has to be very direct here, but he does have a way to equalize, which is to challenge this knight on c3. He starts with knight b6. White is still ill-prepared to capture on e4. He cannot take with the knight due to the pin. He cannot take with the queen due to queen takes b2 with devastation. So white plays bishop e2. And again, if you fall asleep at the wheel here with castle, then after white castles back, you have a very difficult position after something like bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, where your queen is offsides and in danger of being trapped, and white has all this extra space. Despite the pawn up, I think this is very bad for black. Instead of castles, though, black can play knight a4, which is a very important move, challenging the knight on c3 before white can unpin it. So after castles, we now go bishop takes c3, bc, and now another very important tactical resource is knight takes c3. Black grabs a second pawn. And also white is going to lose his bishop pair because realistically he has to take this knight. If he if he lets the queens get exchanged, 2 pawns is too much. For example, after bishop h5, queen takes c2, and knight a4, white definitely has some compensation for the 2 pawns here. In fact, he probably has enough for 1 pawn and maybe then some, but 2 pawns is a lot. And it's very hard to actually see white doing something that really proactive. I mean, he can put his pieces on good squares, but so can black. Black can go, you know, knight back to b6, keep nice and safe, bishop d7, slowly complete his development, and eventually black will be up material. I think this position is very good for black. So what white should do is play queen takes c3. More than anything else, this keeps the queens on the board. And now after queen takes e2, black's queen is actually pretty safe because she can come back out to h5. And the only question is if black is going to get crushed before he can complete his development. And I think the answer is no. For example, if white plays d5, aiming to crash through on g7, and black castles, I don't really see the compensation. White can establish a pawn on d6, but after something like f6, blunting this bishop from supporting the pawn further, this bishop is now basically a glorified pawn once black plays e5. And already here, I think black is basically winning. The d6 pawn is pretty firmly under control, and the 2 pawns up will really matter. White's best move is queen b4. Which looks very scary because it threatens checkmate and also stops black from castling. But again, after f6, this bishop on h4 is blunted. And while the position looks a little bit shaky, the king will come to f7. And the king is reasonably safe there. And I think that black is okay here. Now, I think white's probably not worse. I do believe he has full compensation for 2 pawns just because black's pawns are very slow and his development is not great. But at the same time, black is pretty solid. And if you gave white a few moves in a row to try to give checkmate, it's not that easy to see what he's going to do. And overall, I think I would probably prefer black here. I mean, in general, I'm not a super materialistic guy, but in this particular case, it feels like there's going to be a lot of pressure on white to try to show something for his material down. And I just think it's going to be very hard for him to pull that off. Queen a3 is very similar as well. He can play this, and once again, f6 is the best response, and the black king will be quite happy on f7. So I was pretty happy with this variation. I couldn't really find anything else for white at this point, because after queen takes a2, if he does something else, like if he plays bishop e2, we're going to go grab this pawn as well. Now this knight is hanging too, which forces white to exchange the queens, and then things are starting to go very, very wrong indeed. So this I don't think is so great for white. I think it is much more challenging for him to take with the c knight and maintain the knight on d2, just because this way he's able to secure it a little bit more easily. So after d takes e4, white now has 2 serious moves. Bishop h4 is definitely best, but he can also play c5, which was tried by Luka Lenic. And here, black needs to remember a very important in-between move before he executes his plan. So basically, I think black's best plan is to play b6 and break down this c5 pawn and then be able to play bishop a6 later. But I think it's very important that you start with the move f6, and I'll try to explain why. So if you play b6 right away, this was Fressine's decision in his game with Lenic. After a3, bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, queen takes d2, king takes d2, b takes c5. If white were just sort of automatically take back on c5 here, I quite like black's position after a5 because he will play f6 and e5, which will blunt this bishop on g5 out of the game forever. And then black is ready to play bishop a6, trading off the light squared bishops, and then abuse the b file, and I actually prefer black's position already. The problem is white's not going to take back. He has this very clever move b4. And the reason that I think white has a pretty decent position here is that his bishop has the potential to come back to e3. So for example, after c takes d4, e takes d4, bishop b7, and b5, we'll see this position later on where white's bishop on hg5 is somewhat marooned, but here he has a lot better chances. And this I think is very dangerous. So what I want to do instead is I want to, instead of b6, I want to start with the move f6, which immediately asks this bishop where it wants to go. If the bishop comes to f4, that's ideally where it would like to go, but it's going to run straight into e5. And then this is a very tough position for white to deal with. I don't really see a great way for him to handle it. I mean, he can try bishop g3, I guess, but after h5, this bishop can get chased even more, and he's going to have to constantly worry about e takes d4 and queen takes a2 coming. And I think black he's broken down white's space advantage in the center and will remain a pawn up. So naturally, white will play bishop h4 to avoid this e5 attack, although now and only now we play b6. And here we see the difference, which is that after a3, we chop everything off on d2, take on d2, king takes d2, b takes c5. Now after b4, we see that after c takes d4, e takes d4, bishop b7, we saw this exact same position a second ago, but without the moves f6 and bishop h4 included. And this is enormously in black's favor just because this bishop on h4 is going to have a really hard time getting back into the game. For example, after b5, rook c8, b takes c6, rook takes c6, bishop b5, and rook b6. Like in a position like this one, after rook c5, for example, here the move king e7 is legal, thanks to us having already played f6. And there's all sorts of things like this, and the bishop on h4 is just badly misplaced, and as a result, I think black is doing well. So I think it is very important that if white plays c5 here, that you first start with f6, remaining flexible. Because if bishop f4, you can break in the center with e5, and if bishop h4 and the bishop is marooned, then and only then you play b6. So the move order is important, but I think f6 is a very nice in-between move that secures black a good position. But here the best move is definitely bishop h4. And again, black's position is going to be absolutely wretched if he just falls asleep. If he castles and white goes a3, his position is just horrible. White has all the extra space. You will have the bishop pair because you don't want to lose the e5 pawn. This is really bad news. So we're going to go and grab this pawn. Now, white has two serious tries. I think his best attempt here is just to accept that he's going to be material down and say in for a penny, in for a pound, and play bishop e2. But he can also try queen c2 to hang on to the material. But unfortunately for white here, now black will go queen a5. And if black is able to take on d2 and exchange the queens, I think that white's compensation is going to be much less impressive. And after something like bishop e2, bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, queen takes d2 check, king takes d2, and now e5, black was ready to quickly castle and play f6 to blunt this bishop. White undoubtedly has some compensation, but a pawn is pretty good, and without the queens, I don't think white's going to have a huge amount of counterplay. The computer calls it equal, but already here, I think more pressure is on white to prove the compensation because black is the one with the pawn up. But white's best move is to play bishop e2, which is extremely direct and very aggressive. And the point is that he's ready to sacrifice a second pawn even in order to accelerate his development and just say, you know what, I don't care about material at all. I'm going to use my development and extra space and try to launch some kind of attack and get your queen stuck behind enemy lines. It's a very aggressive way of playing, but in my opinion, it's actually the most challenging one. So the old main move here was queen a5, which was aimed at prophylaxis against castling because the knight on d2 is hanging. But I don't like it because white can actually castle anyway. And his point is that following bishop takes d2, he goes rook a1, attacking this queen. Black must play queen b4 to save the bishop. And now after queen c2, a very strong move, black cannot stop rook a4, which will win back the piece on d2. And then for the price of one pawn, basically we're going to get... I'm happy to play a position like this one where I'm a pawn up and white has like this big center and whatnot, but only if I'm able to exchange queens. And here, for example, after something like castles, rook a4, and say, I don't know, queen b6, queen takes d2. This position without queens, I don't really mind, but with queens, I think this is extremely dangerous. White may just play f3, open the king side, and start playing bishop d3, e4, e5, and giving checkmate. So I think it's very important that the queens are still on, and that I don't like. So I think black should take a second pawn on b2. And it's actually almost like free because it's not like you're losing time since the threat of taking on d2 forces white to play rook c2. Here white cannot just castle his way out of it because now after queen takes d2, he really is losing a piece. He's not just losing like a pawn or something. He's losing this piece and he's not getting it back. So at this point, white plays rook c2, queen a3, and castles. So black is now down, he's up 2 pawns, but he's lagging behind badly in development. e4 is hanging, and he could be facing some serious problems. So the computer's proposal is bishop takes d2, but I really dislike it. After queen takes d2, castles, black is still 2 pawns up, but after c5, his queen is marooned out of play on a3, much like we saw the bishop on a3 in the previous line. And white's plan is very simple. f3, open the king side, deliver checkmate. And he's going to have a lot of firepower directed right at black's king, and black's going to really struggle to defend. And this position looks extremely dangerous to me. So I have a different idea. I think the best one is bishop e7. This is starting to retreat black's pieces. He's taken his pawns. He wants to come back and be safe. So for example, now, if white were to take on e7 and black gets his queen back, yes, he loses one of his 2 extra pawns, but now clearly he's not going to get checkmated. He is totally safe, and he's a pawn up. And he can castle, and then next up he's going to play e5, and he's getting his pieces out, and he's doing extremely well. I can't see any problem with black's position. He just looks like a pawn up to me. So that's not okay for white. He has to instead play bishop g3. And this is a very good move because not only does it avoid exchanging pieces, but it also makes it much harder for black to get back with his queen. One of white's best hopes here is to try to trap black's queen because she is so far offsides and having trouble getting back. But I think that black is still okay. So he castles here. Now white has two options. It's very human to go grab this pawn to only become one pawn down. But I also don't think this is very challenging. Here I'm actually ready to give back a second pawn after e5, because what I want to do is gain the c5 square for my knight and open up this bishop. Following d takes c5, knight c5. In the last two moves, black has lost back both of his extra pawns, but all of a sudden his pieces are springing to life really, really quickly, and we can now evaluate the position on strategic factors because material is equal again. Here, for example, if white were to take on c5, after queen takes c5, I think it's obvious black is doing extremely well. He's ready to play either bishop e6 or bishop f5 to complete his development, in both cases potential with a gain of tempo. White has a very sorry pawn structure, a passive bishop on g3, and black has a very direct route straight forward with this passed a pawn supported by the rook on a8. Strategically speaking, this is a fantastic position for black. It's much better for white to preserve his knight and bring it to the d6 square, but following bishop takes d6, e takes d6, and bishop f5, all of black's pieces have found good squares. White will struggle enormously to find a good square for this rook. For example, if rook d2, knight b3, the rook is already getting trapped. So it probably will have to go back to something ugly like c1, and after a5, black certainly has his fair share of counterplay. His queen is in no danger whatsoever. And this a-pawn is actually really, really fast. Like if black just in like the next few moves goes a4, queen b2, a3, like that pawn basically just promotes. And it's like there's nothing white can do to stop it. So, and I don't really see how much counterplay white has in the meantime. So in general, I'm pretty satisfied with this position. Knight takes e4, I think, is a very human move. The best move is c5 here, but I believe you're more likely to see knight takes e4 in practice. And then I really like that e5 move to break out black's pieces and get back in the center. But as I mentioned, I believe the best move is c5. This queen is now in serious danger of becoming trapped, but I think black can break her out with this move b6. So white can certainly take on b6, but after black takes back, he will take this pawn, and then he will go ahead and even take the other pawn on e4, but that only leads to an equal material position where black's queen clearly is not getting trapped anymore, and black is the one with the passed pawn. So I don't mind black's position at all here. After something like knight takes e4, rook fc8, I think black is absolutely fine, and in fact I would somewhat prefer him because he has this passed b pawn, but realistically it should be about equal. So after b6, white has to be very careful. Queen b1 might look like it's about to trap the queen with something like rook a2, but after b takes c5, the queen will get the b4 square, and she will get out. And as far as I can tell, black is just fine here. He's going to lose back. He's up 3 pawns right now. He's definitely not going to hold all of them. Like for example, white could do something like d takes c5, knight takes c5, and now that this d pawn is gone, if white plays rook to a2, queen c3, the queen has a route back to f6. After something like rook c1, queen f6, knight takes e4, and queen takes e4. White already took 1 pawn back. He's probably going to take a second and probably even a third, but even then it's just going to be a draw. For example, after something like rook d8, queen takes c6, bishop d7, queen b7, you're going to lose the a7 pawn, but then you're also just going to immediately agree a draw. So this is okay. The best move, and the one that the computer claims gives white an advantage, but that I disagree with, is knight c4. And the point is that after queen a4, queen d2, at this point, finally, your queen is trapped. She will be lost. But the only way for white to trap the queen is to play rook to a2, and then meet something like queen b3 with rook a3, and eventually this queen will get trapped. So for example, there's a few ways, but if you were to go and just ignore white with b takes c5, I think the easiest way now for white is to play rook b1, and now the queen she cannot get away, and rook a2 comes next, and she will be lost. But I found a move that I think gives black an okay position, which is bishop to a6, counterattacking this knight on c4. So now if white were to play rook b1, trying to trap the queen, black is able to play bishop takes c4, and if bishop takes c4, now b5. And because this bishop is hanging on c4, white is not in time to play rook a2, and black will then go queen a6 and escape, and then he is 2 pawns up and basically winning. White can try rook takes c4, when black is forced into a discovery, but there's nothing special for white to do with it. And after something like c takes b6, a takes b6, rook takes c6, and queen back to a2, the queen will come to d5, and black is absolutely fine. So basically here, at this point, because bishop takes c4 is coming, the only way for white to actually get black's queen is to play rook a2 right now. Well, this doesn't necessarily get the queen, but it will trap this bishop. So for example, if black were to play queen b5, after rook fa1, this bishop on a6 is going to be lost, and obviously we're going to lose. But here we see my point. I'm going to take on c4. So now if white takes the bishop, queen d5, black's queen escapes, and black is 2 pawns up and basically winning. So white really has to take the queen. And here we can take stock of the situation. Currently, black has 2 pieces and 2 pawns for a queen. One of those pieces will immediately be upgraded to a rook after either bishop takes, because the rooks are forked. This bishop on c4 is going to trade for one of white's rooks. So very quickly, black is going to end up with a knight, rook, and 2 pawns for the queen. His position is loose enough that I would expect him to lose one of those 2 pawns, but nonetheless, I still think he is absolutely fine here. The computer, Stockfish, calms down eventually and calls it equal, but in fact, I actually almost prefer black. I think that white's queen will not be that effective because black's position is so solid. The reason a queen can be better than multiple smaller pieces is they can attack a lot of things at once. And since black doesn't have that many things to attack, I think that the queen will not be that great. Eventually, the computer calls it equal. But again, in practice, I think black has an easier game here. His play is so easy. Just whichever, this bishop will take whichever rook doesn't move. Then he brings rook fc8 to overprotect the pawn. Eventually starts pushing the a pawn. And I can't really see what white's doing in the meantime. So this concludes my coverage of the Semislav, at least in the theoretical portion. I'm gonna go over a lot of illustrative games as well to try to go over some of the key ideas. And throughout the illustrative games, they won't always play exactly the moves I'm recommending, but a lot of the ideas that I think will be important. I'll make clear notes as to where they are deviating from what I'm suggesting for you. But in any case, I was very satisfied with this repertoire that I found, and well, I hope you are too. So thanks very much for getting all the way to the end. I know it's a fair amount of work, but hopefully this repertoire will serve you well and earn you a lot of points. So thanks much, and I will see you for the annotated games.